Today I'm going to be talking about whether or not the iPad line and the iPad in general is just not the same and is kind of dying. Let's get into it. So I've been doing a lot of thinking recently, and I've been thinking about the iPad line. What is the most controversial line of products other than the iPhone that Apple sells? I definitely have to say that the iPad is up there. Now, it's mainly because the iPad itself hasn't been changed in so many years. Like, it's had the same sort of design language, and it's had the rounded corners, and some lines have had the bezels, and it's stayed the same. But what has mainly stayed the same, and is what is holding back the iPad from being amazing, definitely has to be the software. Now, the software just isn't there, and I just struggle to understand why Apple haven't done anything with this. The iPad runs off a version of iOS. Now, this is obviously called iPadOS, but it is basically iOS with some slightly tweaked versions of iOS. So you have better mouse support, slightly better Apple Pencil support, because you don't get that on the iPhone. It's a shock to me that Apple haven't tried to make the iPad better by improving the software. Now, they obviously have added Final Cut Pro and Logic Pro to the iPad, which is nice of them, but they've also done a monthly subscription. Now, this is very controversial because obviously those softwares you can buy outright if you have a Mac, and it's very difficult to port over a desktop version of an app to a touch version of, the same app. So obviously the iPad has better touch support for those apps, whereas the Mac is built for mouse and keyboard. I think a lot of people wanted this, but not in the way that Apple did it. Everyone wanted Apple to bring over these apps and for them to be exactly the same as macOS, so that if you want to, you can work with Final Cut Pro on the go without having to take your laptop with you. Now, this was obviously amazing for people that have never had Final Cut Pro before and can now have access to it. It's honestly such a good thing, and I do think that Apple did the right thing by making it a monthly subscription, because it makes it easier for people that want to get into these softwares without having this massive £300 price up front. Now, for a lot of people, they're not going to be happy about that, but monthly subscriptions do mean that we're most likely going to get more updates, and we're also going to get more people having these softwares, making better videos, and I honestly think it can only be a good thing. Now, obviously, it's not a great thing, and you're going to get charged indefinitely, and it's going to eventually come out to be more than if you were just to buy it outright. But for a lot of people, they don't have that money to pay for these apps outright. I would rather pay for an app once and then not have to worry about it again. That's just not the case anymore. And I do think that Apple bringing these apps over was kind of them saying, look, we do think the iPad Pro is a serious tool, but we don't think it's serious enough to port over a version of macOS. Now, it's very weird because I'd say that iPadOS on the lower versions of the iPad, like the iPad 9th gen, the iPad 10th gen, is absolutely fine. And the iPad mini as well. But when you're bringing an M1 chip to an iPad, you kind of expect to be treated like a desktop. You've got a desktop processor on this iPad that isn't being used to its full potential. It's just there for no reason. It's not really supplying anything other than having Final Cut Pro and Logic Pro on the iPad Pro. That's the only thing that they've been used for, and you can get the M1 chip on an iPad Air. So if you wanted to really get into the iPad ecosystem and get these apps, you could just get an iPad Air. Now, this is what's confusing to me. The iPad lineup is so confusing because we've got the iPad Air with an M1 with the M1 chip, and then we've got the iPad Pros with the M2 chips. Now, for me personally, the M1 and the M2 chip really aren't that different. I genuinely think that, the M2 chip did come in with some good little features, and it was a solid upgrade, but it was also very similar to the M1 chip in the way of, it was not much faster, not that much more efficient. So it is a really interesting argument. Do you get an iPad Air or do you get the iPad Pros? Now, I definitely say if you're not worried about having, the fanciest screen and the fastest processor, just get the M1, because you're gonna have the same exact features as literally all the other iPad lineup. Because iPadOS is so limited in what you can do, and the chip doesn't really matter. We were having iPads with ridiculously powerful chips like the A12X chip that was just ridiculously powerful and was almost going to go into the original MacBook. They didn't do that, and it's kind of left this massive gap because the iPad has a 120Hz screen, mini LED, USB-C, a nice aluminium back, 2 cameras, and it's a beast in terms of hardware. But when you get to the software, it really lets it down. It's really difficult for me to, argue that, yeah, get an iPad instead of a MacBook. Because by the time you spec up an iPad, you could be looking at the price it would cost to get a MacBook Pro. And at that point, you might as well just get the laptop, have the full laptop interface, and then maybe just get, a cheaper tablet, depending on what you're wanting it for. Because I really don't see a need for the iPad anymore. For me, I've never really been a strong tablet user. I had an iPad at one point, and it really wasn't that fantastic. It was good for media, but it wasn't really good for anything else. You couldn't really use it to their full potential because iPadOS is so limiting. There's no proper file system, there's no calculator app, and there's just no way of when you plug something externally into your iPad to be able to properly go through it, transport files, change those files, if you plug in a hard drive, you can't format it, you can't do anything to it. The iPad is so limited that it's such a shame because the hardware is so there and it's so amazing. But when you get to the point where you're being limited by your software, the easiest thing to fix that you can push out to every single iPad, it really does make you think, why is Apple doing this? Now, my initial thought is that they do not want to make the iPad so good that no one buys MacBooks. But I think that there is two different people that are wanting an iPad and a MacBook. One person's wanting a touch interface and one person's wanting a laptop with keyboard, a trackpad, something that they can take on the go that's a beast, that's powerful. The person that is buying an iPad is wanting something that's small, light, portable, and they can use on the go, wherever, whenever, no restrictions in terms of, apps needing to have keyboard and mouse. All they need is something that they can take around that's big enough to show to other people. Now, I think that if you're going for the iPad Pro and you start to spec it up to the price of a MacBook, depending on your use case, if you're using it for editing or music or photos or, editing photos or, that type of thing, go for the MacBook. But if you're using this stuff for drawing and then you're going to be using your hands, you need something that you can take on the go so much easier, and you're not using anything that Mac OS needs. Like, for example, you don't need that Finder window, you don't need external hard drive support to be able to format it, change it, go on to servers, log on, use terminal. If you don't need any of that, go for the iPad Pro, definitely, without a doubt, because it's portable, it's lighter, and depending on what size and variation you get, it can end up being cheaper. But then when we start to get to the lower end of iPads, like the iPad mini, the iPad 9th and 10th gen, and the iPad Air, why do you want the iPad Air so specifically? What use case are you going to be using? Why do you want to save that extra $100, $150 when you could just go for the first iPad Pro, the 11.9 inch, and then you've got the mini LED display, you've got better USB-C, you've got the M2 chip. But I think what it is, Apple do this on purpose because they want you to upgrade to the better version. Because when you go, oh, well, the iPad Air is only this amount of money, it's only $200 off the iPad Pro, I might as well just upgrade. But I do think that's a valuable take, that if you're getting the iPad Air, definitely consider the iPad Pro and whether or not you can afford to make that jump, just because you do get those slight better features. But when you start to get to the iPad 9th and 10th gen, the iPad 10th gen is so close in price to the iPad Air that I really wouldn't say that's worth it. And if you're wanting an iPad like that, that's just, you don't need anything fancy, it's got USB-C but nothing too powerful, and you're just using it to watch stuff, just go for the iPad 9th gen. You're not going to notice that the bezels aren't laminated, you're not going to notice that they're really thick. Just go for the 9th gen, because I genuinely think that you're saving money and it's such a good option. Or you can go for a second-hand iPad that's cheaper, and if you're just watching it, if you're using it just to give to your kid, just get the 9th gen. Don't get anything too flashy, don't get anything too expensive, because it's really not worth it. Apple do not want to give these iPads any more than they're giving them. I mean, they're giving them features that are in iOS years later, like widgets, changeable lock screens. It's just not their priority anymore, and I really do think it's a shame, because something like the iPad mini, loads of people use, and that could do with maybe having some more of those features, because iPad minis, because they're so small, people use them on planes, in construction sites, everywhere. They're used everywhere in the world, and I do think that they could do with maybe having, if you want to, building a custom OS onto the iPad mini that people can use, because it means that you can have that small iPad and you can use it in your own way. Obviously, Apple will never let this happen, but I do think that'd be a really good idea if the iPad mini could have a custom OS that is built on top of iOS. So if you know how to do that, that you can, build your own OS, Apple can check it, and then they make sure it's all safe, and then people can use it. Because I do think in specific scenarios, companies want their own OS. They want something that they've built and that they know everything about. They know that if there's a glitch, they can fix it. Whereas if you have an iPad with iOS and something goes wrong, you don't have full control of that. But I definitely say that the iPad line is dying. People aren't buying them as much, and Apple know this, but they're just not doing anything to save it. And I do think it's a shame, because at one point I really loved the iPads and have always wanted one, but I really just don't see the use case. Especially if you've got a Mac, it can do everything that a Mac can other than the touch bar. So yeah, the iPad is dead, and it is honestly a shame that, you know, we've got to this point where Apple just will not do anything with the software. But, you know, what can we do? But it's been Harry. I'm out. Peace.